Welcome to a video tutorial from Valentia Photography Workshops and me, Stephen Power. This one is about how to get the best from wide aperture lenses. First of all, a quick thank you to those of you who have subscribed in the last few months that we've been running this channel. We're up to over 300 subscribers now, which I know is not a lot in YouTube terms, but it means a lot to me because it shows that people appreciate what I'm trying to do on this channel. I've been teaching photography for about 25 years, and Valentia Photography Workshops in its physical form has been running for about 5 years. So I hope you'll stay tuned to the channel by clicking the little subscription button somewhere down there, and that'll keep you in touch with what we're doing in the future. And also let me know in comments what you might like to see, and I'll make a video on that if at all possible. Today in this video I want to talk about wide apertures on camera lenses, particularly 35mm lenses, but it doesn't really matter. In some ways the principles are the same no matter what format camera you're using. I want to talk about what wide apertures mean, the advantages of wide apertures, and also the disadvantages of wide apertures, and that's easy for me to say. So I'll talk briefly about the wide apertures that I've got on my lenses, or the lens I've got with wide apertures. This is a lens with the widest aperture I own. It's a Canon 50mm ultrasonic, and it has a 1.4 aperture. If you imagine that the very widest aperture possible on a lens is 1, then 1.4 is pretty wide. Another one I have is on my 5D3 at the moment, which is 2.8, which is smaller obviously than a 1.4, and then I've got a couple of other lenses here which don't have particular, well, this one doesn't have particularly wide aperture. It's f4, so it's going smaller, but it's important to know about this type of lens, telephoto zoom lens, when thinking about some of the effects of wide apertures, and I'll come to those later. And this one is a reasonably wide aperture. It's a Sigma 105mm macro lens with a 2.8 aperture, and when it's used as a macro lens, very close-up lens, then the aperture is important in terms of the effect that it will have on the image, so we'll talk about those as well. I've got another video tutorial on apertures in more depth, and how you can tell one aperture from another by looking at the numbers and what the numbers mean. You can look at that somewhere up here, I'm not exactly sure. I'm putting a link up now, and this will give you more in-depth understanding of how apertures work. In this video I want to talk about wide apertures in particular. I'm going to start with what they look like physically, and you can see that in this photograph on the left hand side here, which is showing a wide aperture. Virtually no mechanical structure of the aperture. So here it's just lens really. Here some of the lens has been blocked and made a smaller hole in the middle, and this one where the aperture is at its smallest or narrowest, it's basically a pinprick. In the smaller aperture the light is being squeezed through a very tight hole in the middle, and that makes the image sharper from front to back. In the middle photograph the light is not being squeezed as much, so the sharpness doesn't extend as much, depth of field doesn't extend as much. And in this photograph, where we've got the aperture as wide as possible, a lot of light is coming through, and this gives a fairly unsharp image other than at the point where you've focused. And I'll come back to that later on. This is really important. On the right hand side is a diagram of the apertures going smaller from f1.4 down to f16, and each change is known as a one-stop difference. From f1.4 to f2, for example, one-stop aperture change. f2.8 is 2 stops from f1.4. f4 is 3 stops. If we're going down, if we're closing the aperture down, we're letting in half as much light as we did at the previous aperture setting, if it's a full stop change. If we're opening the aperture and going from smaller to wider, then we're letting in twice as much light as we did, for example, from f4 to 2.8, from f2 to f1.4 is twice as much more light each time. This is important in terms of one of the benefits of using a wide aperture, because to get a correct exposure in a photograph, we need to balance the aperture setting with the shutter speed. And the more light that we let in, the faster the shutter speed can be, because that light doesn't need to stay on the sensor or the film, if you like, we're using a film camera, as long. Wider apertures give faster shutter speeds, and that's helpful for someone who is photographing in low light conditions, at twilight or indoors. If you can let more of that light through the lens onto the sensor, onto the film, then it doesn't need to stay there for as long, so you might be able to handhold the camera, let's say, more safely without risking camera shake. If you're photographing sports and photographing very fast moving people or objects, then you might want to freeze the action with a very fast shutter speed. Let's go into Lightroom now to look at some of the considerations we need to make when photographing with wide apertures. Let's actually start with 2 examples where the wide aperture works quite well. So both of these photographs were taken at f1.4 on a 50mm lens, which is, a relatively very wide aperture, and they both seem to have pretty good effect. We look at this one first of all, of my old camera. The distance between the front of the lens where I've focused and the viewfinders is about 15 centimeters, about 6 inches in old money. You can see that the very wide aperture has left the back of the camera and almost everywhere from the lens board back out of focus. It's quite striking because it leads the eye to where you want the viewer to look, and that's quite important, that you should always focus with a wide aperture where you want the eye to fall. Similarly, 2 chairs in my kitchen, these are about 1 meter apart, and in this image you can see that the second chair is given almost a ghostly effect. The camera, the lens, was sharply focused on this part of the chair. This is where we get some problems, I think, if you're not careful with the focusing at very wide apertures. A reasonably close-up shot of my small jade plant, and if you look here, it, at first glance doesn't look too bad. There's some areas that are well out of focus and other areas that are moderately out of focus, and probably the focused point are these leaves quite close to the front of the plant are out of focus. A couple more are in focus. I think the problems when focusing with wide apertures tends to come more when you start focusing away from the front of the object. So for example, here's the jade plant focused right at the back. It doesn't seem to work well. on the eye. Similarly, focusing at the back of the camera has made the front extremely blurry. And if we compare that with the first shot where we focused on the front, you can see that it doesn't suit the image, it doesn't work. So that's my point with focusing for wide apertures, very wide apertures. You have to get the focusing point bang on. You really need to know where you are focusing and where you want the eye to fall. Another important point to make is that when using longer lenses or macro lenses, the amount of sharpness in the photograph will be less with longer lenses and with macro lenses used very close up than it would be with, let's say, a standard lens like a 50mm lens. Here I've used the Sigma 105 macro lens, and as you can see, the shutter speeds here, which are literally 3 or 4 millimeters behind the lens, are just a complete blur. It's at f2.8, which is the maximum aperture for that lens, and it's caused a great deal of blur. So really, that's bringing us to the end of this tutorial video. I just wanted to show you about wide apertures, the advantages and some of the disadvantages, and really it's those I want to focus on, I want you to focus on. Pun very much intended. Be careful where you focus with a very wide aperture. Think about what that's going to look like. Is it going to jar on the eye, or is it going to be very pleasing on the eye? Is it going to look like a model, or is it going to look like a photograph that you might want to show to other people? Think about your use of maximum apertures. Think about why you're buying a lens with a maximum aperture. Is it a good idea? Is it something that you need to do? All of these things really need to be considered. It took me about 20 years to buy a lens that was wider than f4. I used those f4 lenses professionally for all of that time, for books and magazines and newspapers. So they're not always necessary. Think about why you need them, why you're buying them, and then when you get them, think about how you're going to use them. Hope that was helpful. Please leave me some comments below. Tell me how you're getting on with your wide apertures and which ones you have and why you bought them. And we can start a discussion in the comments. And please subscribe for more videos from Valentia Photography Workshops.